The call reached Hercule Poirot just as the rain began to fall thin at first, like a warning, then steady enough to blur the windows of the motor car that carried him through the narrow country roads. By the time he arrived, the house stood isolated in a veil of mist, its tall windows glowing faintly against the darkness, as though it were watching him approach. Inside, the air was thick not with noise, but with the absence of it. Silence pressed against the walls, the kind of silence that follows something final. Inspector Hale greeted him at the entrance, his face drawn tight. "I'm glad you came, Monsieur Poirot. I confess, I don't like this one." Poirot removed his gloves with careful precision. "You have said this before, my friend, and yet you always find the solution." Hale gave a humorless smile. "Not this time. This time, it's impossible." They moved through the house without another word. In the drawing room, 4 people sat apart from one another, each rigid in their own private dread. None spoke. None even looked at Poirot. Their eyes drifted instead toward the staircase at the end of the hall, as if something up there held them in its grip. "The victim?" Poirot asked quietly. "Upstairs," Hale replied. "Study room." Door was locked from the inside. Poirot's gaze sharpened, but he said nothing more as they ascended. The study was exactly as described and yet more troubling for its simplicity. A single door, heavy oak, unbroken. A single window latched firmly from within. No hidden panels, no second exits. And at the center of the room, sprawled beside the writing desk, lay the body of Mr. Alistair Wren. He had been a wealthy man, Hale had explained earlier. A collector of rare items, a host of exclusive gatherings. Tonight had been one of them. 4 guests, no servants present in this wing, and Wren himself had insisted on privacy. Now he lay with a single wound to the chest clean, precise. No weapon in sight. Poirot moved slowly around the room, his eyes absorbing everything. The desk was orderly, almost obsessively so. Papers aligned, ink bottle capped, a pen resting exactly parallel to the edge, nothing disturbed. Too perfect. "When was he last seen alive?" Poirot asked. "Less than 20 minutes before the body was discovered," Hale said. "They were all downstairs together. Wren excused himself, said he needed to retrieve something from the study. When he didn't return, one of the guests went up to check. Door was locked. They forced it open. And during those 20 minutes, no one left the drawing room, according to all 4 of them, no." Poirot nodded, though his expression suggested little acceptance of such neat testimony. He crouched beside the body, examining the wound. No hesitation marks, no struggle. The man had either trusted his killer or never saw them coming. Then Poirot's gaze shifted to the floor, just beside the desk. A single object lay there, small, easily overlooked. A button, not torn, not broken, simply placed, dark, polished, and utterly ordinary. Yet it did not belong to Wren's clothing. Poirot had already confirmed that with a glance. Hale noticed his focus. "We found that too. Doesn't match any of the guests' jackets either. At least, not obviously." Poirot picked it up delicately, turning it between his fingers. "But the obvious, Inspector, is so often the enemy of the truth." He rose and walked to the door, running his hand along its inner surface. No marks, no tampering. The lock itself was simple, functional and clearly engaged from the inside when it had been broken open. "A locked room," Hale muttered. "No weapon, no suspect. And now, a button that belongs to no one." Poirot smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. "On the contrary," he said softly, "it belongs to someone very precisely." Hale frowned. But they were all downstairs. Poirot turned, his eyes glinting with quiet certainty as the rain tapped steadily against the window behind him. "Yes," he said, "that is what makes it so interesting." He paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to sharpen the unease already coiled in the room. "Because, Inspector, the killer was already inside." Inspector Hale did not immediately respond. The words seemed to linger in the room, pressing against the walls as insistently as the rain outside. Poirot, however, had already turned away, his attention drifting not randomly, but with deliberate precision. He moved again to the desk. "You say, Inspector, that nothing has been touched since the door was broken." Nothing, Hale confirmed. We kept it exactly as we found it. Très bien. Poirot leaned closer, his eyes narrowing slightly. The arrangement was impeccable to impeccable. The symmetry of the papers, the exact placement of the pen, even the angle of the chair suggested something beyond mere habit. It spoke of control, of intention. "Tell me," Poirot said without looking up. "This Mr. Wren, he was a man of order." "Yes." "Obsessively so," Hale replied. "His guests mentioned it. Everything in his life had to be just right." Poirot nodded slowly. "Then it is curious, is it not, that he would allow this?" He pointed not at the desk itself, but just beneath it. Hale stepped closer. At first he saw nothing. Then, as he bent lower, it revealed itself a faint scuff along the polished wood floor. Not large, not dramatic, but fresh. As though something had been moved, Hale murmured. "Or someone," Poirot corrected gently. He straightened, turning his gaze toward the window. The latch was firmly secured, untouched. He tested it lightly, then examined the glass. No cracks, no marks, no sign of entry or exit. "And yet," Poirot said softly, almost to himself, "we are expected to believe in a vanishing murderer." Hale exhaled. "That's exactly the problem." Poirot did not answer. Instead, he walked back toward the body, his steps measured, his thoughts clearly assembling themselves piece by piece. His gaze lingered again on the wound. "Clean," he said. "Precise. No hesitation, no struggle." "He trusted whoever did it," Hale said. "Or," Poirot replied, "he did not have the time to distrust them." That drew a slight frown from the inspector. "You mean," Poirot raised a hand, silencing him not abruptly, but with quiet authority. "Let us not run ahead, my friend. The truth is patient. It waits for us to notice it." He turned then toward the door, studying its broken frame where it had been forced open. Splintered wood, jagged edge damage, no deception there. "But something," Poirot continued, "does not wait." He glanced once more at the button in his hand, then slipped it carefully into his pocket. "Come," he said, "we must speak with the others." They descended the staircase together, the tension below sharpening as Poirot entered the drawing-room once more. The four guests looked up too quickly, too uniformly. It was the reaction of people who had been waiting not for answers, but for judgment. Poirot did not immediately address them. Instead, he walked slowly around the room, observing not just their faces, but their posture, their hands, the subtle shifts in their breathing. "One of you," he said at last, "was the last to see Mr. Wren alive." A man seated near the fireplace cleared his throat. "That would be me, Charles Denton." He excused himself, said he had forgotten something upstairs. "And you remained here?"
Yeah.
All of us did. Poirot's gaze moved from one face to another. A woman in a dark green dress avoided his eyes. Another man tapped his fingers lightly against his knee, too rhythmically to be unconscious. The fourth, an older woman, sat perfectly still, her expression composed, but her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "So," Poirot said gently, "none of you left this room?" "No," Denton repeated, a little more firmly this time. Poirot smiled faintly. "And yet, something has left its place." That drew their attention sharp, immediate. A flicker of unease passed between them, subtle but unmistakable. Poirot noted it. "Tell me," he continued, his tone almost conversational now, "did any of you notice anything unusual this evening? A sound, perhaps? A delay? A moment that did not fit with the others?" There was a pause. Too long. Then the woman in green spoke, her voice hesitant. "There was something." All eyes turned to her. "It was just before Mr. Denton said we should check on Mr. Wren," she continued. "I thought I heard a noise upstairs. Not loud. Just something falling, maybe." Denton frowned. "You didn't say anything at the time." "I wasn't sure," she replied quickly. "It was so faint." Poirot inclined his head slightly, as though acknowledging a small but valuable offering. "A sound," he repeated. "Yes, that would be consistent." "With what?" Hale asked. Poirot's gaze sharpened not dramatically, but with a quiet intensity that seemed to draw the room inward. "With a mistake," he said. Silence followed. Poirot stepped closer to the group, his presence now more focused, more deliberate. You see, he continued, the perfect crime does not fail because of what is done, but because of what is overlooked. His eyes settled briefly on each of them in turn. And already, he added softly, I begin to see what was overlooked. The silence that followed Poirot's words did not break, it shifted. What had once been heavy with fear now carried something sharper, more fragile. Uncertainty. Each of them seemed aware, in their own way, that something small had begun to unravel. Poirot did not rush. He allowed the tension to settle, to press gently against each of them until someone felt compelled to speak. Perhaps, he said at last, we will take things one at a time. Monsieur Denton, you were the last to see Mr. Wren alive. You will be so kind as to tell me exactly what passed between you. Charles Denton adjusted his posture as though steadying himself. There's not much to tell. We were all here, talking. Wren seemed distracted. Then he stood up, said he had forgotten something in his study, and left. And you spoke with him as he departed? Yes, briefly. I asked if everything was all right. He said it was nothing important. Poirot tilted his head slightly. Nothing important, and yet important enough to leave his guests. Denton hesitated. I suppose so. And how did he seem? Poirot pressed. Calm, agitated. Calm, Denton said quickly. Perfectly calm. Too quickly. Poirot gave a small nod, as though satisfied for now. His gaze shifted to the woman in green. Mademoiselle, you heard the sound. She straightened, her fingers tightening slightly against the fabric of her dress. Yes, but as I said, it was faint. I wasn't even sure it came from upstairs, and yet you remember it clearly now. She faltered. Well...
Because of what happened. Of course, Poirot murmured.
Memory has a way of becoming clearer when it must justify itself. A faint flush rose to her cheeks, but she said nothing more. Poirot turned to the man who had been tapping his fingers earlier. The movement had stopped not naturally. It had been halted. And you, monsieur? Poirot asked. You have been most attentive. The man forced a small smile. Edgar Lyle. I don't think I can add much. We were all here, talking about Wren's collection. He was quite proud of it. Yes, Poirot said softly, a man of possessions, of order, of control. Lyle nodded. Exactly, and yet... Poirot continued, you do not seem surprised by what has occurred. That smile flickered. Surprised? Of course I'm surprised. A man is dead. But not shocked, Poirot said gently. Lyle opened his mouth, then closed it again. I don't see the difference. Poirot held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary, then let it pass. Perhaps, he said, the difference is only a matter of timing. He turned at last to the older woman, who had remained silent throughout. Madam, he said, his tone softening slightly, you have not yet spoken. She lifted her chin, her composure intact, though her hands remained tightly clasped. There is nothing to say. We were all here. That is the truth. Poirot studied her carefully. You are certain of this? Yes. No one left the room, not even for a moment. Her answer came without hesitation. No. And yet, there it was, the smallest pause before the word, barely perceptible. But to Poirot, it was as clear as a crack in glass. He nodded slowly. Very good, he said. Inspector Hale shifted beside him. They all confirmed the same thing. No one left. That's been consistent from the start. Consistent, Poirot repeated thoughtfully. Yes, but not identical. Hale frowned. What do you mean? Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped away from the group, his hands clasped behind his back as he began to pace slowly across the room. Monsieur Denton tells us that Mr. Wren was calm, he said. Mademoiselle hears a sound uncertain, but now remembered. Monsieur Lyle speaks of admiration, but shows us something closer to expectation. And Madame, he glanced briefly toward the older woman. Madame is certain, tout certain. The room seemed to tighten around them. You see, Poirot continued, his voice quiet but precise, truth does not repeat itself so perfectly. It shifts. It breathes. But here, We have something else. Something else? Hale asked. Poirot stopped pacing. Yes, he said. We have agreement without harmony. The words hung in the air, strange and unsettling. Poirot turned back toward them, his eyes sharper now, more focused. One of you, he said, is telling the truth. A pause. And the others, he added softly, are telling something very carefully arranged. No one spoke. But this time the silence was no longer empty. It was hiding something. The silence did not break immediately. It stretched, thinned, and then began to fracture under its own weight. A glance here, a tightening jaw, their small betrayals, each one revealing more than words ever could. Poirot allowed it to happen. He had no need to press, not yet. Instead, he turned slightly toward Inspector Hale. It is time, I think, that we understand not only what happened, but why. Hale nodded. We've looked into them briefly. Wren didn't invite people casually. Everyone here had some connection to him. Ah, Poirot said softly. Connections. They are rarely simple things. He faced the group again, his expression calm but intent. Monsieur Denton, he began. You knew Mr. Wren through business, I believe. Denton hesitated, then nodded. Yes, investments. We've worked together for years. And recently? Poirot asked. A pause. Too slight to be accidental. There were disagreements, Denton admitted. Financial ones, but nothing unusual. Nothing unusual, Poirot repeated. And yet, I understand that Mr. Wren was preparing to withdraw from a certain venture, one in which you had placed a considerable sum. Denton's composure tightened. That was not final. But it was likely, Poirot said gently. And cost little you. Denton said nothing. His silence, this time, was more telling than denial. Poirot inclined his head, as though placing a piece carefully onto a board. And you, Monsieur Lyle, he continued, turning smoothly. Your admiration for Mr. Wren's collection, it was quite strong, yes? Lyle gave a faint shrug. Anyone would admire it. It's worth a fortune. Indeed, Poirot said, particularly the rare pieces, the private acquisitions, items not recorded, not insured. Lyle's eyes flickered just for a moment. I don't know what you're implying, he said. I imply nothing, Poirot replied calmly. I observe. He let the words settle, then shifted his attention to the woman in green. Mademoiselle, he said, you seemed uncertain earlier, but uncertainty is often the companion of truth. Tell me a connection to Mr. Wren. She swallowed lightly. I was his secretary. Formally, Poirot echoed. And why did that arrangement end? Her gaze dropped. He dismissed me. For incompetence? No, she said quickly. No, it wasn't that. Poirot waited. Her voice lowered. He said I had become too familiar, that I knew too much about his affairs. Ah, Poirot murmured. And did you? She did not answer. But the silence spoke clearly enough. Poirot nodded once more, another piece sliding into place. Finally he turned to the older woman. And Madame... Your connection is perhaps the most personnel. She met his gaze without flinching. I am his sister. Yes, Poirot said softly. Miss Eleanor Wren. A family bond. One might expect loyalty. One might, she replied evenly. But instead, Poirot continued, there was distance, estrangement even. Her hands tightened again, though her face remained composed. We had our differences. Differences of inheritance, perhaps, Poirot suggested. Inspector Hale glanced at him sharply. Inheritance? Poirot gave a small nod. It would seem that Mr. Wren had recently altered his will, a matter not widely known, but not entirely secret either. Eleanor Wren's composure cracked not visibly, not dramatically, but enough. A slight shift in her breathing, a flicker in her eyes. You see, Poirot went on, his voice steady, each of you has a reason. Money, certainly, but also pride, fear, resentment. The things that do not appear in ledgers, but weigh far more heavily. He began to move again, slowly pacing the room as he spoke. Monsieur Denton stands to lose greatly. Monsieur Lyle stands to gain. Discreetly. Mademoiselle has been cast aside, perhaps unjustly. And Madame, he glanced briefly toward Eleanor. Madame has been denied what she believes is rightfully hers. The web tightened, invisible but undeniable. And yet, Hale said, frowning, none of that explains how it was done. They were all here. Yes, Poirot said quietly. That is the most elegant part of it. He stopped pacing. You see, Inspector, motive alone is never enough. It must align with opportunity. And here, opportunity appears to belong to no one. He turned back toward them, his gaze sharper now, more deliberate. But appearances, he added, are very often arranged. The room seemed to hold its breath. Poirot reached into his pocket and withdrew the button once more, holding it lightly between his fingers. This, he said, does not belong to the dead man, nor, it would seem, to any of you ought, least not in any obvious way. He let his eyes pass over each of them again. And it is here, in a room that no one could enter or leave. A pause. Which means, Poirot said softly, that it was never truly absent. Hale frowned. What are you saying? Poirot's expression did not change, but something in it had shifted. A quiet certainty, now beginning to take shape. I am saying, he replied, that the truth does not lie in who entered the room. He let the sentence linger, unfinished but unmistakable, but in who never needed to leave it at all. Inspector Hale stared at Poirot, the weight of that final statement settling uneasily in his mind. Someone who never needed to leave the room, he repeated. That would mean he stopped, his gaze shifting slowly across the four guests. Denton, Lyle, the former secretary, Eleanor Wren. For a brief moment, the impossible began to take shape into something dangerously simple. Then Hale's eyes sharpened. The noise, he said suddenly. The sound she heard upstairs. Poirot said nothing. Hale turned quickly to the woman in green. You said it was just before we decided to check on Wren? Yes, she replied, her voice tense. Just before. Hale nodded, his thoughts accelerating. And Denton, you were the one who suggested going upstairs. Denton stiffened. Yes, and you were the last to see him alive, Hale cut in. You spoke to him. You knew he was alone. That doesn't prove anything, Denton snapped, though the edge in his voice betrayed him. It proves opportunity, Hale said firmly. You could have gone up after him. Quietly. Killed him. Locked the door behind you and slipped back before anyone noticed. That's absurd, Denton shot back. They would have seen me leave. Not if it was quick enough, Hale countered. Not if they were distracted. The room shifted against his time, not with uncertainty, but with a dangerous clarity. The kind that comes when a theory feels just solid enough to believe. Hale turned to Poirot. It fits. Financial motive, last person to see him, and he's the one who initiated the discovery. Classic misdirection. Poirot's expression remained calm. Too calm. But Hale was already moving. Charles Denton, he said, his voice firm now, official. I believe you have some explaining to do. Denton let out a sharp, disbelieving laugh. This is ridiculous. You can't seriously think the evidence is pointing in one direction, Hale interrupted, unless you can explain otherwise. Denton's composure began to crack. Not fuller but enough. His eyes flickered briefly toward the others, as if searching for something support, perhaps, or confirmation that this had gone too far. But none came. Even Lyle had leaned back slightly, distancing himself. The woman in green looked pale, uncertain. Eleanor Wren remained still, her expression unreadable. You're making a mistake, Denton said, more quietly now. I didn't kill him. Then explain the timing, Hale pressed. Explain why you were the last to see him and the first to suggest we check on him. Because he was taking too long, Denton snapped. Because it was strange. Convenient, Hale said. Silence fell again, but this time it carried a different weight. A conclusion seemed to be forming, settling into place. Hale exhaled, as though reaching the end of a long pursuit. I think we have enough to proceed. He gestured toward the door. I'll need you to come with me. Denton didn't move. For a moment he simply stood there, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Then, slowly, He shook his head. "No," he said. "No, this isn't a right." "No," Hale repeated. "This is too neat," Denton said, his voice steadier now. "Too easy. You're forcing it." Hale's expression hardened. "The facts are clear." "Are they?" Denton shot back. "Or are you just desperate for them to be?" That struck something, but before Hale could respond, another voice entered the silence. Soft, measured. "We," said Poirot. Both men turned. Poirot had not moved from where he stood, but his presence now seemed to fill the room in a way it had not before. His gaze rested not on Denton, but somewhere slightly beyond him, the shape of the situation itself. "It is, how do you say, tempting," Poirot continued. "A solution that presents itself so readily. Motive, opportunity, behavior it leans, yes." Hale frowned. "You don't agree?" Poirot tilted his head slightly. "I agree that it aligns." A pause. "But alignment," he added gently, "is not the same as truth." Hale's confidence wavered, just slightly. "But everything points to him." "Everything obvious," Poirot corrected. The distinction hung in the air. Poirot stepped forward now, slowly, his eyes moving once more across the room over each face, each reaction, each carefully held breath. "You see, Inspector," he said, "when a case resolves itself too quickly, it is often because someone wishes it to." No one spoke, but something had shifted again. Not outwardly, not dramatically, just enough. As though, somewhere beneath the surface, the real story had flinched. The room did not recover from Poirot's words, it adjusted around them. What had seemed momentarily resolved now felt unstable again, as though the ground beneath their conclusions had shifted just enough to make standing on it uncertain. Inspector Hale exhaled slowly, drawing back from Denton. "If not him, then what are we missing?" Poirot did not answer at once. His gaze drifted not aimlessly, but with quiet intention back toward the staircase, toward the room above them, where the stillness of death waited unchanged. "We are missing," he said at last, "the beginning." Hale frowned. "The beginning? We already know how it happened, or at least how it could have." "Yes," Poirot said softly, "but we do not yet know why it had to happen tonight." That word lingered. Tonight. Poirot turned back to the group, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied them not as individuals now, but as parts of something larger, something that extended beyond the walls of this house. "Tell me," he said, "this gathering, was it a regular occurrence?" Lyle shook his head. "No, Wren was selective. He only invited people when he had something to show." "Ah," Poirot murmured. "To show or to reveal?" Lyle hesitated. "I don't follow." "But you will," Poirot replied gently. He turned his attention to the former secretary. "Mademoiselle, you said that Mr. Wren dismissed you because you knew too much about his affairs." She stiffened slightly. "Yes, and these affairs," Poirot continued, "they were not always honest, I think." Her silence confirmed it. Poirot nodded slowly. "Hidden transactions, private acquisitions, deals that leave no record. A man who collects not only objects, but secrets." Hale's expression sharpened. "You think this is connected to something like that?" "I think," Poirot said, "that such a man does not gather 4 people into one room by accident." The implication settled heavily. Poirot turned to Eleanor Wren. "Madame," he said, "you mentioned that you and your brother were estranged. May I ask when this estrangement began?" Her gaze held his for a moment before she answered. "Years ago, after the death of your father." A flicker brief, but unmistakable. Hale noticed it. "What does that have to do with this?" Poirot did not look away from Eleanor. "Everything, I think." Eleanor's composure remained intact, but something colder now lay beneath it. "Our father's death was unfortunate, but it was natural." "Natural," Poirot repeated softly. "Yes, that is what was said." The room seemed to tighten. Poirot turned slightly, his voice taking on a quieter, more deliberate tone. "But there was, if I recall correctly, some question at the time. Nothing proven, of course. Only whispers. A dispute over inheritance. A change in the will, very close to the end." Hale's eyes widened slightly. You're saying I am saying nothing yet, Poirot replied. Only that the past has a way of remaining unfinished. He began to pace again, slowly, thoughtfully. Consider, he continued, what we have here. A man who profits from secrecy, a sister who believes herself wronged, a business associate facing loss, a collector with flexible morals, and a secretary who has seen too much. He stopped. All of them connected not only by the present, but by knowledge. Knowledge of what? Hale asked. Poirot turned, his gaze sharp now. Of something that was never meant to be fully known. Silence followed. Then, slowly, the woman in green spoke, her voice quieter than before. There was something, she said, before I left his employment. Documents. Old ones. He kept them locked away. He was very particular about them. Poirot inclined his head. What kind of documents? I didn't see them clearly, she admitted, but I recognized one name. A pause, my own. That drew a reaction, subtle but immediate. Lyle shifted. Denton's eyes flickered. Even Eleanor's stillness seemed to tighten. Poirot noticed all of it. And the others? He asked gently. Did you ever see their names as well? The woman hesitated. Then, reluctantly, she nodded. Yes. The word settled like a stone dropped into still water. Hale looked between them. What does that mean? Poirot's expression had changed, not dramatically, but enough. The pieces were no longer scattered. They were beginning to form a shape. It means, he said quietly, that this was not a gathering. He let the thought complete itself in the silence. But a reckoning. No one moved. No one spoke. But in that moment it became clear his crime had not begun tonight. It had merely returned. The word hung in the air, and with it came a silence that no one dared disturb. It was no longer the silence of confusion or fear, but something more dangerous. Recognition. Poirot allowed it to deepen. Then, quite unexpectedly, he changed his tone. But of course, he said lightly, almost as if correcting himself, this is all speculation. We must not allow imagination to outrun evidence. Inspector Hale glanced at him, slightly taken aback by the shift. You just said I said what the facts suggest? Poirot replied smoothly. But facts, Inspector, must be tested. Always tested. He turned back to the group, his expression now calm, almost reassuring. You have all been most cooperative, he continued, and I believe it is time to confirm something very simple. No one spoke, but their attention sharpened. Poirot reached into his pocket and withdrew the button once more. This, he said, holding it up, is our only true witness. It was found beside the body, in a room that was locked. It does not belong to the victim, and none of you have claimed it. He let his gaze pass over them slowly. So, he went on, we will proceed in the most straightforward manner. Each of you will come forward, one at a time, and allow me to examine your clothing more closely. A missing button, even a well-hidden one, leaves its trace. The simplicity of the request seemed almost disarming. Hale nodded. That makes sense. But Poirot was not watching Hale. He was watching them. Denton was the first to react too quickly. Fine, he said, stepping forward. Yow'll find nothing. His confidence returned just a little too easily. Poirot inclined his head. Merci. He examined Denton's jacket carefully. Every button was intact, firmly attached. No loose threads. No recent damage. Très bien, Poirot murmured. You may step back. Denton did so, his expression tightening slightly, not with fear, but with something closer to irritation. Next came Lyle. He approached more cautiously, his earlier composure now tempered by something less certain. Poirot's inspection was just as thorough. Aganothing. All present, Poirot said softly. Perfectly in place. Lyle exhaled quietly as he stepped back. The woman in green hesitated before moving forward. Her hands trembled slightly as Poirot examined the front of her dress, the cuffs, the seams. No, Poirot said gently. This does not concern you. She stepped away quickly, relief evident. Only one remained, Eleanor Wren. She did not move immediately. For a moment she simply sat there, her hands still clasped tightly in her lap. Then, with deliberate calm, she rose and stepped forward. Poirot watched her closely, not her face, but her hands. Madam, he said quietly. "If you please." She inclined her head. Poirot began his inspection, not hurried, not forceful but precise. Her dress was dark, elegant, with small, understated buttons along the sleeves. He paused, just briefly, then continued. Inspector Hale leaned slightly closer. "Well?" Poirot straightened. "All accounted for," he said. A breath seemed to release across the room, subtle but collective. Hale frowned. "Then the button AA," Poirot said softly, turning the small object between his fingers once more. "Yes, the button." He stepped back, his gaze shifting agonot to their clothing now, but to their faces. "You see," he continued, "a button does not always betray itself by absence." Hale blinked. "What do you mean?" Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked slowly toward the fireplace, as though the matter had already begun to settle in his mind. "Sometimes," he said almost thoughtfully, "it betrays itself by presence." That drew a pause. "A replacement," Hale said slowly. Poirot smiled faintly. "Exactly, Inspector. A remplacement is never quite the same." The room tightened again, and this time it was Eleanor Wren who reacted, not outwardly, not dramatical, but in the smallest, most revealing way. Her right hand shifted, just slightly, as though for a fraction of a second she had forgotten where it should rest. Poirot saw it, and in that instant something invisible but decisive fell into place. He turned back toward her, his gaze now steady, unwavering. "Madam," he said softly, "you have been most careful." Eleanor met his eyes, but for the first time since he had arrived, she did not look entirely in control. The shift in Eleanor Wren's composure was so slight that, to anyone else, it might have passed unnoticed. But Poirot did not miss such things. He never had, and yet he did not press her, not immediately. Instead, he let the moment drift, as though it held no particular importance. He slipped the button back into his pocket with deliberate calm, turning once more toward Inspector Hale. "For now," he said lightly, "we observe. We do not conclude." Hale frowned, frustration beginning to surface. "But you saw it. Something's off with her." Poirot gave a small, almost dismissive gesture. "Something is off with all of them, my friend. That is the nature of such gatherings. The tension loosened, but not entirely. It lingered, stretched thin across the room like a wire pulled too tight. Then a sound, sharp, sudden, from upstairs. All heads turned at once. It was not loud, but it was unmistakable, distinct crack of something striking wood, followed by a faint, hollow echo. For a fraction of a second, no one moved. Then Hale swore under his breath. The study. He was already moving before the word had fully settled. Poirot followed, not hurried, but swift enough to keep pace as they ascended the staircase once more. The door to the study stood exactly as they had left it, broken, splintered, ajar. But inside something had changed. Hale stepped in first, his eyes scanning quickly. Nothing's he stopped. Poirot entered just behind him, his gaze moving more slowly, more deliberately. The desk. It was no longer perfect. The precise arrangement, papers aligned, pen straight, had been disturbed. Not violently, not chaotically, but enough. One sheet was missing. Hale noticed it a moment later. "There was a document here," he said, pointing. "I remember it, right in the center." "Yes," Poirot said quietly. "So do I." The absence was unmistakable. A clean gap where something had been deliberately taken. Hale turned sharply. "Someone's been up here." "But how?" he added almost immediately. "We were all downstairs. No one passed us." Poirot said nothing. His attention had already shifted away from the desk toward the window, still latched, untouched, then to the door, still the same broken frame. No new damage. No sign of forced entry beyond what had already been done. And yet, Poirot murmured, "Something has vanished." Hale ran a hand through his hair, agitation rising. "This makes no sense. We were all together. No one could have slipped away without being seen." Poirot's gaze lowered slightly to the floor. The faint scuff mark he had noticed earlier. It was still there, but now beside it another, fresh, slightly overlapping the first. His eyes narrowed. "Inspector," he said softly, "when we left this room, How long were we below? 10 minutes, maybe 15, Hale replied. Not long enough for not long enough, Poirot repeated. He stepped further into the room, his movements slow, deliberate. Then whoever did this, he continued, did not come from below. Hale stared at him. That's impossible, is it? Poirot asked gently. The air seemed to tighten again, the boundaries of logic pressing inward. Hale turned back toward the door. We need to question them again. One of them is lying, one of them is acting. Poirot corrected quietly. Hale frowned. Acting. Poirot's gaze remained fixed on the disturbed desk. Yes, he said, because this is not desperation. He gestured lightly toward the missing document. It is precision. A pause. Someone knew exactly what to take. Hale's expression hardened. Then that document mattered. It connects to everything you were saying the past. The secrets, yes, Poirot said softly. It was a piece of the truth, and now it's gone. Poirot straightened slowly, his expression combut beneath it. Something had sharpened. Not gone, he said. Hale blinked. What? Poirot turned toward him, his eyes steady. Moved, the words settled with quiet weight. Because, Poirot continued, if it were truly gone, then the person who took it would already be safe. A beat. But they are not, he added. Hale's breath slowed. Why not? Poirot's gaze shifted toward the doorway, toward the house below, toward the 4 people waiting. Because, he said quietly, they are still here. The implications settled like a shadow stretching across the room. Someone had risked everything not to escape, but to stay ahead. And now the truth was no longer just hidden. It was being actively erased. The weight of Poirot's words lingered as they descended once more, heavier now than before. The house no longer felt merely silent, it felt watchful. Inspector Hale moved faster this time, urgency tightening every step. If someone went back into that room, he muttered, then they must have slipped past us. Or they did not slip, Poirot said quietly behind him. They waited. Hale glanced back, but there was no time to question it. They had reached the drawing room, and something was wrong. At first, it was subtle. The arrangement of the room was the same. The chairs, the dim light, the faint crackle of the fire. But one chair was empty. Hale stopped mid-step. Where is she? The woman in green. For a second, no one answered. Then Lyle spoke, his voice tight. She was here. She didn't say anything, just stood up and left. Vain, Hale demanded. Just a moment ago, Denton added quickly. Right after you went upstairs. Hale swore under his breath and turned sharply toward the hallway. We need to find Herno. But Poirot did not move. Too late, he said softly. Hale froze. What do you mean, too late? Poirot's gaze had already shifted toward the corridor, leading deeper into the house. Not toward the entrance, not toward escape. In this house, he said quietly, no one leaves without being seen. A beat. So if she is no longer here, he continued, then she has not gone far. The implication struck almost instantly. Hale moved first, pushing past the doorway into the corridor. Poirot followed, his pace measured but unwavering. The house seemed to narrow as they moved through it, each step tightening the air, each shadow deepening. Then a door, half open, at the end of the hall. Hale reached it in seconds and pushed it wide. Inside, the woman lay on the floor, still. The green of her dress stark against the pale rug beneath her. Hale rushed forward, dropping to one knee. Miss, but the word died before it could finish. He checked for a pulse. Nothing. Poirot stepped in quietly, his eyes already taking in the details. No struggle, he said. Again. Hale looked up sharply. Again? Poirot gestured lightly toward the body. The position, the stillness. It is familiar, is it not? Hale's expression darkened as he understood. The same method, he said. Fast, clean. No hesitation, Poirot added. Hale stood slowly, his jaw tightening. So now we have 2 murders. Not 2, Poirot said. Hale frowned. What? Poirot's gaze moved briefly across the room, then settled back on the body. This, he said softly, is not merely a second crime, a pause. It is a correction. The word hung cold in the air. Hale stared at him. You think she took the document? Yes, Poirot said. And I think she understood something she was never meant to understand. Hale's thoughts raced. So whoever killed Wren killed her too. To silence her, Poirot inclined his head slightly. But that means Hale began. That the killer is still among us, Poirot finished. They both turned, back toward the drawing room, back toward the two who remained, Denton, Lyle, and Eleanor Wren. But now something had changed. The balance had shifted. Because before, they had been suspects. Now one of them was no longer just hiding the truth. They were actively destroying it. And worse, they were not finished. Hale moved toward the door again, faster now. We need to secure them. No one moves. No one, Inspector. Poirot's voice stopped him. Hale turned. Poirot stood still, his gaze distant for a moment as though aligning something final in his mind. Then it sharpened. Be careful, he said quietly. Hale frowned. Careful of what? Poirot's eyes flicked once more toward the body on the floor, then back toward the corridor. Of assuming, he said, that the next move has not already been made. The meaning struck just as a sound echoed faintly from the direction of the drawing room. Not loud, but unmistakable. A chair, scraping suddenly across the floor. Hale didn't wait. He ran. And this time even Poirot followed without pause. They reached the drawing room in seconds, but in those seconds, something irreversible had already shifted. The chair that had scraped lay overturned near the fireplace. Charles Denton stood beside it, breathing hard, his composure fractured for the first time. Edgar Lyle remained near the far wall, pale, rigid, as though unwilling to move even an inch. And Eleanor Wren, she was no longer seated. She stood near the mantel, one hand resting lightly against it, her posture composed once more but not as it had been before. This stillness was different, not defensive, decided. Inspector Hale stepped forward immediately. No one moves. But the command felt late, like an echo arriving after the sound had already faded. What happened here? He demanded. Denton gestured sharply toward Lyle. He moved. He tried to leave. That's not true, Lyle snapped, though his voice lacked strength. You're the one who jumped up enough, Hale cut in. No one is leaving this room. Poirot had not spoken. His eyes moved slowly between them, not with urgency, but with a deepening clarity. Something was settling not in the room, but in his mind. The pieces were no longer scattered. They were aligning. Inspector, Poirot said quietly. Hale glanced back. What is it? But Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward the fireplace, toward Eleanor Wren. She did not move as he approached. Her gaze met his calmly, but there was something beneath it, something no longer hidden, but not yet revealed. Poirot stopped a short distance from her. You have been very composed, madam, he said softly. I see no reason not to be, she replied evenly. No, Poirot murmured. Of course not. Composure is a kind of preparation. A faint flicker passed through her ice butt. It was gone almost instantly. Behind them, Hale continued questioning the others, his voice sharper now, pressing for clarity, for contradiction, for anything that might anchor the chaos. But Poirot was no longer listening. He was watching. Not the panic, not the fear, but the stillness. His gaze shifted to Eleanor's sleeve, to the small, dark buttons that lined it, identical, perfectly placed. Too perfect. Then to the memory of her hand shifting earlier. Then to the button in his pocket. Then to the study, the scuff marks, the missing paper, the second scuffresh. And suddenly it was no longer a collection of details. It was a sequence, a pattern. Poirot exhaled softly. Inspector, he said again. This time there was something different in his voice. Hale turned fully. Yeah. Poirot did not look at him. His eyes remained on Eleanor. It is curious, he said slowly, how often we are misled, not by what is hidden. A pause, but by what is repeated. Hale frowned. Repeated? Poirot reached into his pocket and withdrew the button once more. This, he said, holding it up, was found beside the first victim. He stepped closer, yet it does not belong to him. Nor, it would seem, to any garment, at least not in any obvious way. He moved slightly to the side, just enough. "So we search for what is missing," he continued. "A torn thread, a gap, a flaw." He shook his head faintly. "But there is none." Silence. Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Because the flaw," he said, "was never in what was missing." He lifted the button slightly higher. "But in what was added." The room seemed to still completely. Hale's eyes widened slightly. "Added?" Poirot turned at last, looking at him directly. "A replacement, Inspector," he said. "Not to conceal absence, but to create it." Hale stared at him, the meaning beginning to form but not yet complete. Poirot stepped back, his attention returning to Eleanor. "You see," he said softly, "the button we found, it was never torn away in struggle." A pause. "It was placed." The words settled like a final piece locking into position. Hale's breath slowed. "Placed to suggest someone else." "Yes," Poirot said. His gaze did not waver. And to distract from the one detail no one questioned. Eleanor's hand shifted again just slightly, but this time everyone saw it. Poirot's voice lowered. "Not the missing button." A beat. But the identical ones. The pattern had been there from the beginning, in plain sight. Perfect. Deliberate. And now impossible to ignore. Poirot's gaze remained fixed on Eleanor Wren, and slowly, imperceptibly at first, the room's tension began to crystallize around her. The stillness of her figure, the careful poise of her hands, the deliberate evenness of her breathing, all of it, spoke not of fear, but of calculation. Every subtle movement now felt rehearsed, purposeful, as though the very air she occupied was an extension of her mind. Hale, sensing the shift, tried to interject. "We need answers." "Why?" What could justify? Poirot raised a hand gently, stopping him. "Patience, Inspector. Observe first. Listen. The motive, when it is true, does not shout. It whispers. It twists the world quietly, until the victim is nothing more than a tool for its expression." Eleanor's eyes flicked toward Poirot, then slightly downward. There was no outright defiance now, only an internal battle, a trace of tension that betrayed the unyielding control she had tried to maintain. Poirot walked slowly, circling the room with deliberate attention to each object, each face, each nuance. Then he stopped, his gaze landing on a small portrait on the mantelpiece, half hidden in shadow. "Yes," he murmured. "The final piece." Hale followed his gaze. The portrait showed a younger Eleanor, smiling faintly, seated beside a man whose face was unfamiliar at first glance. But as Poirot leaned closer, inspecting it carefully, recognition flickered in Hale's eyes. "Is that Wren's father?" Poirot nodded. "Indeed, and not merely a likeness, but a memory, a trigger. The father's influence, long absent in presence, yet still shaping hearts and minds." Eleanor's hand twitched slightly, almost imperceptibly toward the frame. Poirot noticed. "Madam, do you recall the terms of your father's will?" Her composure wavered for the briefest instant. Then she responded evenly, almost rehearsed. "I do. It left certain privileges, certain responsibilities, which my brother inherited." Poirot inclined his head. "And yet, despite this inheritance, you were dissatisfied." "I was not dissatisfied," she said calmly, though the tiniest edge had crept into her voice. "Ah, but satisfaction and justice are not always aligned," Poirot said gently. "You saw what your father's arrangements concealed, opportunities that were denied, secrets that were withheld, and you decided." He paused, letting the silence deepen, to correct them. Hale's eyes narrowed. "You Minch killed Wren for the inheritance?" Poirot shook his head slowly. "No, Inspector. That is far too simple. The financial aspect was secondary, a convenience. What drives Madame Wren is far more intimate, far more consuming." He stepped closer to Eleanor. "It is the restoration of control, the correction of imbalance. A man who thrives on secrecy, hiding truths, and a sister who refuses to be powerless in that narrative. That is the true motive." Eleanor's gaze shifted, flickering away for the first time. The smallest shadow of fear crossed her otherwise impassive face. Poirot's eyes caught it immediately. "You see," he continued, addressing the entire room now, "Madame Wren could not abide the thought that knowledge and power over that knowledge remained in the hands of another. She created opportunity. She manipulated perception. She placed evidence. She removed witnesses, not for greed, not merely for revenge, but to assert dominion over the very story of her family, to control who lived and who did not. Hale stepped back, letting the weight of the revelation sink in. So this, all of it, was personal, psychological. She wanted to rewrite the past to suit her sense of justice. Exactement, Poirot said softly. And that, Inspector, is why the button, the missing document, the careful Timmingle seemed both reckless and meticulous. They are the signature of a mind consumed with correcting the past in ways that the law cannot measure and yet must endure. Eleanor's hands shifted again, smaller now, more restrained, as though acknowledging that the subtle web she had spun was finally visible. Her eyes, still defiant, reflected a trace of resignation. Poirot studied her a moment longer. The motive, he said quietly, almost to himself, was never in the objects, nor the money, nor the opportunity. It was here. He tapped his temple lightly. The need to dominate the story, to control the truth, to settle old accounts with a past that would not leave her in peace. And for that, she went to extremes. The room seemed to exhale as the reality settled in. It was more than murder, more than deception. It was the unraveling of a carefully maintained psychological imperative, one that had claimed lives with chilling precision and would have continued had Poirot not seen the pattern before it could extend further. Eleanor Wren, for all her composure, was caught not merely as a criminal but as a human shaped by obsession, memory, and the unyielding desire to impose her will upon a past that had, until now, seemed untouchable. Poirot allowed the room to absorb the weight of his words, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make every heart tighten. Eleanor Wren stood still, her hands folded in front of her, her composure remarkably intact, but now, for the first time, it carried the brittle tension of someone who knows their control is slipping. "Madame Wren," Poirot said softly, his voice calm, deliberate, yet undeniably commanding, "we have observed much this evening. Steps taken, movements concealed, evidence placed and removed, all in service of a design, I believe, that you have pursued for a very long time." Her eyes met his, sharp and calculating. "And if I have?" she asked evenly. "What of it? You have no proof." Poirot inclined his head slightly, the faintest trace of a smile crossing his lips. "Proof, madam, is sometimes unnecessary when the mind itself betrays the truth." He turned, pacing slowly, deliberately, allowing his movements to draw attention to the study doorway, to the chair overturned, to the space where the second victim had fallen. "Observe the pattern, the precision, the objects left to mislead, the items removed to conceal, and yet each tiny gesture, each careful placement, is still visible to a certain eye." Hale watched Poirot, unsure whether the detective was luring Eleanor into speaking or simply cataloguing his observations. Poirot's eyes, however, never left hers. "Inspector," he said quietly, "will you do me the honor?" Hale stepped forward, nodding. "Yes, sir," Poirot continued, his voice calm, measured, as he listed the details Eleanor had attempted to control. The button beside the first victim carefully replaced the subtle scuff marks leading to the study, the missing document, stolen not to gain advantage, but to prevent others from understanding the truth, and most telling of all, the identical buttons she wore to mirror the false trail she had crafted. Each fact he articulated tightened the trap invisibly, weaving a net from observation, psychology, and precision. Eleanor's face did not falter outwardly, yet a subtle tension crept into her posture, a hand flexing almost imperceptibly, her breathing measured but not entirely even. "And so, madame," Poirot said, stepping closer, his gaze now fully unrelenting, "all roads lead to you. Not by chance, not by assumption, but by your own careful orchestration. You sought to rewrite the past, to correct old imbalances, to assert dominion over your family's secrets. You removed obstacles. You silenced witnesses. And even perfection has its cracks." Eleanor's lips pressed tightly together. A flicker of hesitation passed through her eyes, a brief but telling momentary shift in her composure. Poirot took a measured breath. "You may deny it, attempt to flee, attempt one last act of control, but you are contained. Here, in this house, Under observation with the pattern exposed and the pieces aligned. The net has closed, madame, and only one choice remains. For a heartbeat, Eleanor said nothing. Hale tensed, prepared to intervene, but Poirot's presence alone held the room in a taut stillness. The detective's calm was absolute, a quiet authority that rendered panic meaningless. Then Eleanor's eyes flicked toward the doorway, calculating, weighing options, the slightest twitch of a shoulder suggesting a final desperate movement. Poirot's gaze followed. He did not flinch, did not move. His voice remained soft but edged with certainty. There is no escape, not tonight. Not ever from the truth that has been placed in plain sight. Her shoulders slumped imperceptibly. The sharpness in her eyes dulled just slightly. The first words came low, measured, but unmistakable. "You understand, then," she said quietly, almost to herself. "All of it. The steps I took. The control I sought." Poirot nodded, his expression calm, almost tender. "Yes, madame, I understand everything." A pause. Then the confession, more complete, more deliberate, spilling out in careful sentences. The inheritance, the secrets, the obsession with correcting perceived injustices, the murders, the manipulated evidence, the timing of each act. Every motive, every step, every concealment laid bare under Poirot's steady scrutiny. Hale exhaled slowly. Good God! Poirot's gaze softened only slightly as he observed Eleanor Wren finally relinquish her control. The trap, composed of pattern, psychology, and meticulous observation, had worked exactly as intended. No violence was necessary, the truth itself had ensnared her. The detective's mind, however, never fully relaxed. He knew the danger had been great, the precision exact, and the psychology profound. But with the confession now complete, the final act of manipulation revealed, the night's events had found their conclusion. Poirot's eyes rested on Eleanor, steady, unyielding. "And now," he said softly, "justice may proceed in its proper course." For the first time that evening, the house exhaled not with fear, but with the still, heavy certainty of a story fully told, a pattern revealed, and a villain finally unmasked. Just as Hale moved to secure Eleanor Wren, carefully taking her into custody, Poirot's eyes lingered on her for a long moment, then drifted slowly across the room, scanning every corner, every shadow, every object left in place. There was a rhythm to his gaze, a meticulous choreography that Hale could not fully understand, yet felt the tension of. Then Poirot paused, his fingers tapping lightly against his chin. "Inspector," he said softly, almost as if speaking to himself, "something is amiss." Hale froze mid-step. "Amiss? The confession, it's all here. She's the killer. It's over." Poirot shook his head faintly. "Ah, my friend, do not be too quick to believe closure has arrived. One must always consider the possibility that a confession is convenient and perhaps carefully orchestrated." Hale frowned. "Convenient." She admitted everything. "Yeah,"
Poirot said quietly, "but admission and truth are not always the same.
Observe her attention, her composure. Even now she seeks to direct our focus, to confirm that we see what she wishes us to see. But the smallest detail betrays another hand, a hand unseen until now." He stepped toward the fireplace, where the portrait had drawn his attention earlier. His gaze moved along the mantel, pausing on the slight, almost imperceptible tilt of a small framer picture of Edgar Lyle, leaning back in a chair, a faint smirk playing on his lips. A subtle, private photograph, not part of the main display, yet clearly placed with care. Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Notice, Inspector. Madame Wren has confessed. Yes, but did she orchestrate all of this alone?" Hale blinked, confusion mixing with dawning apprehension. "You mean someone else?" Poirot nodded slowly. "Indeed. Someone who understood her motives, anticipated her moves, and manipulated the events from behind the curtain. Someone who wanted the appearance of a confession while maintaining their own agenda. Observe the small details she could not have controlled, the second scuff mark in the study, the timing of the removed document, the misplacement of the chair before we found her bogey. These are not the marks of Madame Wren alone, they bear the signature of a mind anticipating every step, every reaction." Hale's stomach tightened. Then Poirot turned, his gaze sweeping the remaining figures. Denton shifted slightly, his hands brushing the edge of the rug nervously, avoiding Poirot's eyes. Lyle remained still, pale but composed, though the faintest tremor ran through one hand. Poirot's eyes lingered on him, the smallest smile tugging at the corner of his lips, not his own, but a subtle reflection of recognition. "Edgar Lyle," Poirot said softly, the calm in his voice impossible to ignore. "It is you, Nest Seapass, the true orchestrator. The hand that guided Madame Wren's actions, that nudged her toward decisions she believed were solely her own. You understood the psychology, and you used it." Lyle's face went pale. His lips parted slightly. I don't know what you mean." Poirot's gaze did not waver.
You know very well.
"You observed her obsession with correcting the past. You saw the pattern she would inevitably follow, and you let her believe she controlled the course, while you ensured the outcome suited your designs. 2 deaths, a stolen document, a confession orchestrated, all for what? Power over the family, yes, but also over the narrative itself, the satisfaction of being unseen, while the world watched the hand you guided." Hale's voice dropped. "You mean Lyle was behind it all along? He manipulated Wren?" Poirot inclined his head. "Exactly, Inspector. The brilliance of his design lies in subtlety. He allowed the confession to emerge, convincing us that the case was closed, while he remained a silent architect. Only the smallest inconsistencies, misaligned frame, the timing of actions, the psychological cracks reveal his role. And these we noticed in time." Lyle's hands trembled now, a slight shiver traveling through his body. "You can't prove it," he hissed. Poirot's lips curved faintly. "Proof, my friend, is in the pattern. The hand that guides a mind leaves a trace, even when invisible, and every trace leads, inevitably, to you." The room seemed to constrict with a sudden clarity. Hale moved forward, reaching for Lyle, the weight of the final revelation settling like a stone. Eleanor Wren, still cuffed, looked at him with the first flicker of genuine surprise in her eyes. She had thought the confession complete, the story finished, but Poirot had revealed a layer she had never considered. And in that moment, the full truth hung in the air. The mastermind was not the one who had acted with murder, but the one who had orchestrated the chaos, the hidden conductor who had played all others like instruments. The final twist had arrived, leaving no room for denial and ensuring that justice would reach its true target. Poirot stood quietly as Inspector Hale led Edgar Lyle toward the door, the man's hands restrained and his face pale with shock, yet his eyes still burning with defiance. Eleanor Wren followed, subdued, her previous confidence diminished now that she understood she had been a pawn as well as a participant. The house, which only hours ago had been thick with tension and uncertainty, felt suddenly hollow, the shadows of deceit lingering in every corner. Poirot's gaze swept the room one final time, noting the subtle misalignments, the displaced objects, the minor inconsistencies that had hinted at Lyle's manipulations. "Inspector," he said softly, his voice precise, "observe carefully the manner in which the events unfolded. The button placed beside the first victim, the misdirection with the document, even the timing of the second body's discovery all were orchestrated to create a false narrative. Madame Wren confessed, yes, but she believed herself entirely in control. It is precisely this illusion that Lyle exploited." Hale exhaled, rubbing his temples. "And all this time we thought she was the mastermind. Incredible. I can hardly believe it." Poirot's eyes twinkled faintly. But that is the nature of genius, Inspector. The truly clever hand works not with brute force, nor with overt threat. It works through suggestion, through subtle influence, guiding others to act while remaining unseen. We saw the pattern, yes, but we almost missed the puppeteer behind it. It is in the small details, those tiny discrepancies, that the mind reveals itself. The scuff marks in the hallway, the precise alignment of the chair, the button identical to those on her sleeve were not random. They were clues deliberately left and deliberately designed to mislead anyone unobservant enough to see only the obvious. Hale nodded slowly. So every small action, every inconsistency weren't just mistakes. They were breadcrumbs. and you followed them." "Exactement," Poirot said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "The brilliance is that the breadcrumbs were never intended to be followed by the average observer. Only the methodical, the attentive, the one who considers both psychology and pattern, could perceive the hidden truth. And that is why justice, when it is served, is never simply a matter of confession or evidence, it is a matter of comprehension. One must understand the mind, not merely the act." The room seemed to settle as Hale reflected, the weight of Poirot's insight grounding him. Lyle was taken into custody, Eleanor Wren escorted by officers, the stolen document recovered. The immediate threat had been neutralized, yet a faint unease lingered. Poirot moved toward the window, gazing at the darkening evening beyond the glass. "And yet," he said softly, more to himself than anyone else, "justice is sometimes incomplete. Even when the guilty are caught, the world remains altered by their actions. 2 lives lost, secrets revealed, the family's history forever changed. One must reconcile oneself not to triumph, but to understanding. And sometimes the most clever villain leaves behind threads we can only hope to grasp in time." Hale joined him, glancing back at the empty spaces where chaos had once reigned. "You always seem one step ahead, Poirot. Even when the case appears solved, you uncover what we cannot see." Poirot nodded, his gaze lingering on the room where so many lives had intersected in tragedy. "Yes, mon ami. That is the duty of the detective, to see not merely what is presented, but what is hidden, to discern the truth beneath illusion, and to bring light, however faint, into the darkness." A quiet shiver ran through the house, as if it recognized the closing of one chapter and the lingering shadows of another. Hale exhaled again, a mixture of relief and lingering tension in his chest. "So it's truly over?" Poirot allowed a pause, letting the weight of the events settle. Then he smiled faintly, the smallest gleam of mischief in his eyes. "Over, perhaps, or perhaps merely paused. For the clever mind often leaves traces, and the world is full of observant eyes, my friend. Justice may be served today, but vigilance must remain always." The inspector glanced at him, uncertain whether Poirot meant caution or warning. Poirot simply adjusted his coat, his gaze returning one final time to the room, noting once more the subtle misplacements, the faint echoes of the minds that had acted and be acted upon. "And that," he said softly, "is why one must always observe even when it seems the story is finished. The truth, mon ami, is never truly quiet. It merely waits for the one who knows how to listen." Outside, the evening deepened, shadows stretching across the estate. Justice had been served, yet the house seemed to remember the cunning that had passed through it. And somewhere in the lingering quiet, the faint impression of unseen calculation remained, as though reminding them all that even victory carries the weight of what might have been missed. Poirot paused at the edge of the driveway, the crisp evening air brushing against his coat, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves and distant rain. The estate behind him was silent now, the officers having departed with Eleanor Wren and Edgar Lyle in custody, their confessions and manipulations catalogued and sealed for the authorities. The immediate threat had been neutralized, yet the house seemed reluctant to release the tension it had harbored for so long. Hale fell into step beside him, quiet for once, letting Poirot's calm demeanor guide the final moments of the investigation. "Do you think it's truly finished?" he asked. His voice, low and uncertain, betrayed the lingering unease that only came after witnessing such calculated deception. Poirot's eyes, bright and reflective, swept the estate one last time. "Finished?" "Ah, mon ami, the term is relative. One may close a case, secure the culprits, and yet the echoes of their actions remain. One may leave a house without fear of further violence, and still find subtle traces of minds that do not rest." He paused, his gaze catching the faint glimmer of something near the hedgerow, a folded piece of paper, almost imperceptible in the dim light. He did not move toward it immediately, his attention instead lingered on the air, the shadows, the subtle disturbances left by events that had seemed so final moments ago. "Poirot!" Hale said softly, noticing the direction of his gaze. "What is it?" Poirot inclined his head slightly, his lips pursed in thought. "There is nothing to worry about. Not yet. But notice, Inspector, how the smallest detail may conceal the most potent revelation. A note, a mark, A subtle gesture of ease may have escaped our attention, yet hold the promise of another story, another truth waiting to emerge. He glanced toward the faint glow of the estate windows, imagining the corridors now empty yet still heavy with memory. Hale frowned. "You mean there's something we missed?" Poirot allowed a faint smile to play at the corner of his lips. "Not missed exactly, but left deliberately, perhaps by design or perhaps by accident. The mind that orchestrates such events rarely acts without leaving a faint signature. A line of thought, a clue too small for the ordinary eye to grasp, a whisper that reminds one there is always more to observe." As they walked slowly toward the road, Poirot's cane tapped against the cobblestones in measured rhythm, each step deliberate, reflective. Hale kept pace, senses sharpened by the evening's revelations, but even he could not fully read the detective's mind. "And so, Inspector," Poirot said quietly, "we leave the house, the confessions complete, the guilty secured. Yet one must always remember, a story is never truly closed. There is always a residue, a hint, a minor discrepancy that refuses to be fully explained. One may leave satisfied, yet still curious. The mind, like a fine clockwork, carries forward even when the main mechanism appears stilled." Hale glanced back once, toward the looming silhouette of the estate, feeling the residual weight of the mysteries that had unfolded. "So you expect another twist?" "Perhaps," Poirot said, the faintest glimmer of intrigue in his eyes. "Perhaps it is nothing. Perhaps it is everything. We shall see. But always, Inspector, the attentive eye must remain vigilant, for even when the night appears quiet, subtle truths continue to whisper." He paused at the edge of the road, adjusting his coat. A solitary lantern flickered in the distance, the shadows of the evening long and intertwined. "The case is closed, yes, but life has a way of ensuring that the next question is never far behind. And the observant mind," he said softly, more to himself than anyone else, "must always follow it." With that, he continued down the road, the faint echo of his cane striking against the stones fading into the quiet night. Behind him, the estate receded into darkness, still holding secrets, still guarding the faintest hint of mystery, a reminder that even in resolution, a story's final chapter is never truly written. The night whispered possibilities, and Poirot, as always, walked ahead of them all, a step removed yet infinitely aware, ready for whatever the next puzzle might bring.